Welcome to the Investor Coaching Show. Here's your host, Paul Winkler.
And welcome to the Investor Coaching Show. I am Paul Winkler, talking money and investing. Yeah, so we go through two phases in life. A, make money. B, spend it later on when you can't or don't want to work anymore. And that's the idea, is to make sure that you have something set aside. Because as I often tell younger people, every 7 years you wait to start putting stuff away, putting money away for retirement, you cut your retirement in half. That's just basically on the rule of 72. 72 divided by the rate of return gives you the amount of time it takes for money to double. If you think about it, if you miss a doubling period in time, you cut your income in half. You can cut it in half. And that's really what we're dealing with here, is making sure that you don't have that situation because you decided to wait too long. Now, one of the reasons we wait too long, and that's what I thought I'd start with today, is we often wait too long because, life gets in the way. First of all, you go to college. If you go to college, if you don't go to college, you go to work. If you don't go to work, you're living in your parents' basement. But, you get out there in the world and start to decide, hey, what do I want to do? And a lot of times, younger people especially can't figure out, what on earth do I want to be when I grow up? I was talking to somebody about this the other day, and a friend of mine, and it was at the university level. And basically what he said was, I'm telling my kids, don't worry about getting out of college even, graduating, and not knowing what you want to do. A lot of times you're not going to know what you want to do right away. And I said, so true. I think about when I was in college, I was working in a company, doing computer repair work. The last thing that you could ever expect me to do for a living is that. And yes, computers were around back then. But we were actually doing a lot of things that I wouldn't even think of doing today. But, it was a great experience learning what I liked, what I didn't like. I remember working at a landscaping place, a nursery, and going, man, there are certain aspects of this job I love. There are certain aspects of this job I absolutely hate. And, the parts that I love, I still do to this day. The part of what I did there that I liked, I still do to this day. I love teaching. And that's what I spent my time doing at the nursery. I was teaching about what kind of plants did what, and what kind of plants loved what kind of soil and all of that, and what would work in the climate and so on and so forth. But, the reality of it was I didn't want to do that type of work for a living, but there was something about teaching that really hit a chord for me, and I really like doing it. So, think about, if you're a younger person, think about what you really love doing and make sure that you are spending your time in it. If you're an older person listening to this and going, you got younger people that you're trying to influence, tell them to really look at aspects of their job that they really love. Where are they engaged in activity in their job where they lose track of time? That is typically what I call a distinctive genius. It's something that you're just built to do. And if you're built to do that and you're really, really good at it, recognize that other people are not good at what you are good at, and recognize that you can make a niche for yourself in that particular area. So, to me, that is a really big deal in coming up with what the career is that you're going to do. And then, of course, looking at jobs that are difficult to do, that nobody else wants to do, or that there's a lot of prep to be able to do it. There's a lot of education there, and you're having to go through something. And it's just like investing. If we look at the investments that are easy to hang on to and feel really comfortable about, like cash, I don't have to worry about it going up and down in value. I can just put my money in and know I can get the same amount of money out in a week, in a year, or, and it may not have the same purchasing power, but it will be the same nominal value. If I put $100,000 into a bank account, I can get $100,000 plus whatever interest it pays in a year from now, and I know it won't be $75,000. It won't be fluctuating in value. Well, because it won't fluctuate in value, you won't see the returns that you would see with something that does fluctuate in value. And historically, we look at stocks and they can be all over the place, but $1 in treasury bills that don't fluctuate in value, remember, grows to, over the last 100 years, $22 versus $14,000 for large U.S. stocks and well over $20,000, $30,000 for small companies and over $100,000 for small value. And progressively, each one of those that I named has a higher level of volatility to them. But that is risk and return. If we look at the same thing with careers, we have the same thing going on. Risk and return are related. Or level of hassle is the way I like to look at it. The more hassle you have for a job, the more danger there is in the job. Or maybe there's more preparation time that it takes to learn how to do it, and you have to go through the hassle, again, of going through classes and writing papers and doing all of those things that you have to do in college. Well, then that causes a lot of people to drop out. And when it causes a lot of people to drop out, there are fewer people to do the job. And of course, lack of supply can create much higher incomes. If there aren't a lot of people that will do something, then you have to pay the people that will do it more money. And that's the beauty of just the way the world works. And, and there's so many parallels. Well, there's something I'd seen in a financial publication in CNBC.com. I often pick on them for having a lot of information about investing that's just bad. But this one I thought was pretty good because it was just on teaching kids about money. And I was having a conversation with a friend of mine this week, client, and he was just talking about how he taught his kids about money. And I said, oh, it's so funny you bring that up. That is exactly one of the things I thought about talking about on the radio show, is what do we teach people about money? What do we teach kids about money? And he talked about, hey, for him, debt was a big thing. Making sure that people understood how problematic debt was. And when I teach about debt, I'm very balanced about it because, some people say debt is always bad. And a friend of mine put it this way. He said, if debt is always bad and it's always evil, then if you own a savings account, you are contributing to the delinquency of other people. It's not exactly the way he said it, but that's the way I like to put it. Because you think about it, if you have a savings account, you're allowing somebody else to be in debt because they're borrowing money off of you. So being that one-sided on all of that is not such a great approach. But, the reality of it is there's certain types of debt that are okay. Let's say I have debt on an appreciating asset. I might talk to a business owner that is starting a business that has a lot of capital need. In the very beginning, they might have debt on that business, but the plan is to try to grow this business to being well worth more and outstripping any kind of cost that they had to pay to use the capital. And that's, companies issue bonds all the time. What is a bond? A bond is just when a company borrows money over a certain period of time, or government borrows money over a certain period of time. The company will borrow the money, and what companies love about bonds is that they don't have to give away ownership rights to the company. They just borrow the money. They pay the interest for a period of time because that's the way typically bonds work. You borrow $1,000, let's say, and then you pay the interest payment. Let's say if it's 5%, you're going to pay $50 per year to use that money. And then at the end of the term, if it's a 10-year bond, in 10 years, you pay the $1,000 back. And you don't have to give away any ownership in the company, so you don't have to give away any control, anything like that. Now, the problem is for a lot of companies, they're going, I'm not positive this business plan is going to work. In 10 years, it may take 15 years. So borrowing money for 10 years may be a problem because they may not be able to pay it back or may be worried about paying it back in 10 years. Or if the term is even shorter, it could be a bigger problem. They're borrowing for 3 years or 5 years or whatever. So you'll have intermediate bonds is what those are called. Now, what happens in this particular case is if you are worried about being able to repay it, you may have to issue ownership in the company, and that's where companies issue stock. So you issue the right to own the company. Now, when you issue stock, there's a whole different deal that is going to go on here. Now the company has to share the profits because you're now an owner. And there are two ways they're going to do that. They're going to pay dividends. And, those dividends may be very, very low if it's a small company. They may not pay profits back right away to the shareholders, but you'll have some companies that may have high dividend rates. It's a mistake, really, is the way I look at it, it's to explain it this way, to go, hey, I need just to have lots of dividend-paying stocks in my portfolio, and that's all I need. And the reason that's a problem is because then you only own companies that can't think of anything better to do with their profits than pay them back to shareholders. So it's just a little pet peeve of mine. People teach that as this is the way to get income in retirement, dividend-paying stocks. And I'm like, oh gosh, that's just so short-sighted. And also, if the dividend rate is very high compared to the share price, that means, by definition, the company could be they could be a very distressed company. So yeah, when you're older, you just go out and buy a bunch of distressed companies. That's really brilliant too. There's so much bad teaching in the investing world. But anyway, back to the point. So we look at dividends as part of the profits. Then you have retained earnings. The companies plow the earnings back into the company, and they go, hey, let's take some of the earnings off of what we have been making money on, and let's expand into new areas. Let's look at building another operation. Let's build another building. Let's, buy more inventory in different areas and expand what we're doing, expand the services that we've got or whatever. So that is what a company is going to do with the earnings. And then what happens as well is because now you're an owner of the company, you get to vote on the company and their operations and what they do and who the leaders of the company are. Are they doing a good job? Is the CEO doing a good job? How about the board of directors? Are they decent? And let's make sure that we have people that are running the company in the appropriate way that we believe that they ought to be. And that's where you sometimes hear about activist investors. Activist investors will take their ownership rights and they will use it to try to drive the direction of the company. So you got stocks and bonds, and those are two ways that companies raise money for operations. And when we're looking at, when we're talking about kids, is teaching them these concepts. And it's good to teach them these concepts. But, when we talk about debt, sometimes people just go, debt is always bad. And debt, on depreciating items, I'm not a big fan of. And, sometimes people can make a case that there are certain times when, they'll borrow money out of convenience. I've seen situations where people are able to borrow on a car and the interest rate on the loan is like super, super low. And then if you ask them to try to reduce the cost of the car, that they won't do it for whatever reason. They won't do that. I've seen that happen before. So I'm not going to be dogmatic about never borrow money to buy a car or anything like that. I'm usually not dogmatic on a lot of things, but a lot of times people borrow to buy a car because they don't have the money. And if you're borrowing, and you, let's say, I had a guy that actually had an interest rate, it was below 1%. And the money that he had in the bank was earning like 4 to 5. And it's like, why on earth would I take the money out of the bank, paying that rate of interest to pay cash, and when I can borrow it at that rate? And it's like, good point, not a bad point. Now, typically where I am okay with debt is on appreciating items. Houses. People will, borrow to buy a house. They'll borrow to buy a business or their education sometimes. But you got to be super, super careful about any of this stuff because you end up in a situation where you're doing things to impress people. That's where it becomes problematic. So often what people do is they tend to spend money trying to look a part. It's kind of like the book The Millionaire Next Door, talking about wealthy people living in these beautiful houses and they've got no furniture inside. And they're just trying to impress people with how important, how wealthy, and how successful they are. And in reality, it's just an outward appearance. It's not in reality. And often it is because maybe, when they were younger, they were trying to make it in the world, trying to be popular, trying to be somebody in high school, and maybe they were discounted and they were kicked aside and sand kicked in their face or whatever. And when I grow up, I'm going to show all you guys. I mean, that's how often do you see that? When I get older, I'm going to show everybody because I really am somebody. And then, they spend their entire life trying to impress people that aren't even thinking about them anymore or didn't even think much about them when they were kids. But, now they're enslaved to their house. They're enslaved to their cars. They're enslaved to a lifestyle that they can't afford. And now who's paying for it? Certainly not the kids from high school that didn't pay any attention to them. It's them. It's their families. So debt on depreciating items, things that go down in value, think cars, think couches, think TVs, and those types of things. Typically, that's where I just go, no, don't do that. That's a bad deal. So investor and author Alexa von Tobel has written about this, talking about children, and I thought I would just make a little comment about some of the things being talked about in here and add to it. They're talking about kids can usually grasp financial information at an early age. And, I found that a lot of parents that really make sure that they teach their kids about finances at an early age end up with kids that do fairly well. I mean, one of the things I think about with my own kids is how they have, they do investing. They have money set aside. They're really good, at saving and keeping things on the side, not going and blowing it on things. And part of it is just teaching, but, it's part of it is just understanding money and having some kind of literacy at an early age. And they say as early as age 6 that they can actually start to get this stuff. And, they can form their permanent habits really about the age of 7. A lot of what are in our development as children, really, really early on. A lot of it is actually cast at those early ages. So it's really important to get to kids early. And not that you can't teach them something a little bit later, you can, but it's just a little bit more difficult. And, that's why, one of the things that they pointed out here is that's why we want to make sure that we do some of this teaching at an early age. And, if you look at some of the baseline knowledge that people have, you look at the studies that have been done of people and in older adults and just saying, hey, what's their financial literacy? It's amazing how low it actually is. Matter of fact, I was talking to some of the folks at Trevecca. We were talking about coursework and talking about putting together something for the university. And some of the things that we've been discussing are a little bit more advanced, but they were just talking about the baseline education that they do and how popular the courses are. As soon as they do any kind of talk about an investing course, people sign up. Younger people sign up and they really, really go after that kind of thing. Because a lot of them really do understand that they need to know this stuff. If you don't understand anything about investing markets, you don't understand anything about how investing works, or you're given a lot of the bad information there is out there, and the information that you get are from the marketing organizations, like the investment companies. Like, think about it. You go to a local bank and you're going to learn about investing, but you're going to learn about the products that they're selling. And it's not necessarily what you ought to be doing. If you think about when you're told how to buy mutual funds, how many years have I talked about on this show how bad the advice is to look at 5 and 10 year track record when you're buying mutual funds? Because what do markets do? They go up and down. What follows up? Down. What are you doing when you're buying on track record? You're buying after something has done well. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever, but it sells mutual funds. Or what if, you're looking at a period of time where the economy's been kind of rough, or you're hearing bad news, or you're hearing scary things going on. What's the first thing you hear from the investing world? You need to load up on fixed income, you need to start to add a little bit more of bonds in your portfolio, or that's why you need this guaranteed product. You need this guaranteed product because you don't know what'll happen in markets. Well, when do they come out with this message? After stocks have gone down. So that's a track record in reverse. The track record was negative or bad, and they're enticing you to buy something that will hold up or should hold up if things continue to be bad. Well, what you're doing is you're assuming that the track record negative is going to continue, and that's not the way markets work. What I said, markets go what? Up and down, up and down, up and down. What follows down? Up. And you're going and locking in losses. But the investment firms love it because you buy the product. You will buy it because you're scared. You will buy some other product because you're euphoric and you feel great about things. It's all about what you will buy. Well, teaching kids this at an early age is something that they really need to understand how they're being played. That's exactly what's going on. People are playing you when they're playing on your emotions. They're looking at, what will this person respond to? What can I get them to do? Well, I know I can get them to respond to fear, or I know I can get them to respond to greed. And some ages we're more prone to one versus the other. Younger ages we're more prone to being pushed. Well, I say that, but sometimes younger people are also fear-driven. A lot of times. I think back to some of the articles that I had used for years and years, and still use some of them, on teaching basics of investing. And it was amazing to me that the younger people were being driven by fear, back in the late 70s. Late 70s, after there was some roughness in the market, younger people were just basically running away from stocks. So, it's not always the case that just older people are driven by their fears. But older people, quite often driven by fears, and that I can't afford to go through another market downturn. And they don't recognize that market downturns historically don't last that long. But they hear it. They hear somebody talking about, you could lose everything. Well, if you look at, if I lose everything, what typically creates that situation where somebody loses everything? Where I buy just a couple of stocks. I'm not diversified. Or I'm not investing in enough different markets. I can diversify within a market, large companies, or I can diversify across them, or I'm not diversified enough. Now, if stocks go down and never go back up, as I always point out, that means that earnings never came back for the companies. And if earnings never come back, then you don't have any taxes. You don't have any taxes. You don't have any government. You don't have any government. You don't have any FDIC. So the point is that what people do is they are driven by fears without thinking through what they're afraid of. And that's so often what I try to get people to do. When they're anxious, get them to think about, what is it that I'm anxious about? What am I fearful of? How likely is that to happen? What's the evidence that it won't happen? Has it happened ever before in history? So when we think about, and if it does happen, then what might else follow? If stock markets go down and they never come back, what else is going to follow? Well, as I just walked through, government failure. Well, if everything fails, did my little scheme to avoid the risk actually help? Did it work? No. It did me no good. And it just enriched somebody else that was selling something that was a fixed investment product, like an annuity, like an insurance contract, like a money market or a CD or something like that. Now, there are places for these investments. There are places, but what happens so often is we're driven to move all the way. And it's a funny thing is that investors themselves are not even the ones I'm talking to. A lot of times it's the advisors that are pulled in and sucked in and scared and make moves that they shouldn't be making. And the market timing is not investors quite often, the general public. It's the investment advisors that are so pulled in. That's what we see in the research. And what we find is that the investors don't even realize the advisors are doing it. So I often have these little things, and I have videos on my website, how to sneakily check up on your advisor. Things you can look at. Look at the videos there. I give little tutorials on how to check up to see if the advisor is breaking the rules of investing. But anyway, so younger people, This is why I think we want them to understand this stuff. Now, the big area that I try to get them to understand first is on debt. And when we're looking at debt, we're looking at typically buying something before we're ready to have it. And we're often buying something because we want to impress other kids. I mean, think about when I was a kid. Converse sneakers. If you were going to be cool, that's what you needed to own. You needed to own those sneakers. You needed to have a nice car as I got a little bit older, right? It wasn't just sneakers. You got to have a really nice car. And I remember the people being envious of the people in my class that were able to go to ski trips, and I couldn't do it. There was also in this article by Alexa von Tobel, I guess is the way you pronounce her name, just talking about the tone is important that you employ with kids when teaching them. But there's some good lessons here for older people too that I just want to impart as I go through this, because I think there are a few things that need to be mentioned. I hesitate when I talk about, as in recommending any kind of materials. So often, I think a lot of times materials tend to indoctrinate kids into thinking that is not necessarily helpful from an investing perspective. So many myths about investing that I get real frustrated when I read materials and go, I want to be teaching. Like, for example, teaching about individual stock investing, those types of things can be problematic. As I was having a conversation with a friend of mine, he's a professor, and, we were just talking about how the average company does not have staying power in the S&P 500 like it used to. It used to be that companies would be in the S&P 500 for 60 years. And now it's average about 18 years. And he brought up the Dow, and I says, yeah, that's a really good point. And, if you look at, like, for example, the list of Dow companies in just 1982, which is the year I graduated from high school, those companies that were in the Dow, American Can Company, you go, what? Sears Roebuck, what? Owens, Illinois, American Telephone Telegraph, AT&T, well, they're still around. American Tobacco. I mean, think about how politically incorrect can you get nowadays, right? Bethlehem Steel, our steel companies have been a huge problem in America. Eastman Kodak was in there, bankrupt. The inventor of the digital camera, bankrupt. Westinghouse, Woolworth. I remember shopping at Woolworth when I was a kid, right? Who goes to a Woolworth now? I mean, really? So if we look at how companies change and the companies, and the Dow is just 30 companies that are just massive companies, and they're supposed to be representative of the most important companies of our time. It's really the idea behind the Dow is, be able to look at these companies and go, hey, what were the really, really important companies and who should we be paying attention to? And so often, those will be the companies that we typically are going to invest in because they are the important companies. Well, one of the things that she talks about here says, money is simply a tool to help you live the life you want to. Now, I phrase that a little bit differently. Money is a tool to help you express what is important to you. Because if you look at somebody's checkbook in the old days, now credit card statement, now, you can look at what people are spending money on and you can tell what's important to them. What are they trying to express with the way they live their lives? And if you work hard, she says, you can earn money. If you're thoughtful about managing it, you can ensure you always have enough to buy what you need. And I often point out that if you take different people with different levels of income, one person makes 30, one person makes 40,000, another makes 50,000. Why is it so often they end up with the same amount left over? Zero. It's because they typically spend everything that they've got. They don't save anything. And that's why I'm often telling people, hey, save 10%, 15%, get up to 20% for retirement savings. But, have money set aside savings for short-term things as well. When the car goes out, or when the air conditioning unit or the roof needs replacing or whatever, emergencies, putting money aside. Somebody was saying to me the other day that they were so glad that I had recommended starting to put 10% of income away just for emergencies. And he made the point, probably listening now, right? Because they always text me. So I'm sure I'll get it. Go ahead. Just send me a text. But the thing was that he was talking about how it was building up for him. I don't have permission to say the name, but, other than that, yeah, it was really kind of cool. He said, hey, thanks for encouraging me to do that because it's starting to build up. Now, it says that money is not meant to be worshipped. It's also meant to be ignored. Some people do that. It's kind of like Scrooge. They're so focused on money, somehow thinking it's going to be their savior. It's going to be the thing that makes their life better. Maybe, maybe not. Some of the richest people in the world are some of the most miserable too, right? But you don't want to ignore it either. Stick your head in a hole and say, hey, this is, money is evil. Because some people come to that conclusion, right? The rich, I used to have this exercise I'd bring people through and I'd go, finish this sentence. The rich are what? And then they would finish the sentence go, they're lucky. They're, they're greedy. They're, and they would come up with some negative word. And the point that we would make is like, hey, you know what? If you got a really negative connotation of finances, chances are really good you're probably not going to accumulate much because you have a negative connotation of finances or financial freedom, right? And, the reality of it is having money set aside, you go through two phases of life. One, you earn money, and then money makes money for you. And what you're doing is you're investing. If you're investing in stock markets, you're investing in the companies that make the great things. And you're giving access to capital for companies to make the great products that we all love. And that's what capitalism is. You're able to participate in the growth of companies all around the world. And companies, to be successful, have to be other-centered. They've got to be focused on solving somebody else's problem. That's the beauty of capitalism. Now it says, talk to your kids about money in ways that make sense to them. It could mean talking about how much everyday items cost. Like noting the bottle of water, how much it costs at the zoo versus going down to the corner store and buying that same bottle of water. Recognizing that some companies charge way too much for something because they've got you as a captive audience. And maybe just think about waiting until you go down to the convenience store to buy it versus buying it at that expensive place. This costs $29. Mommy doesn't have $29 for this today, but we'll think about saving it and getting it for your birthday. And what this does is it teaches kids that costs can vary. It teaches them that, maybe you don't have to have that thing right away. Maybe you can delay gratification, as I always told my kids. Wait till later. You don't have to have everything. There's something about that anticipation of getting that thing that's kind of exciting. Did you ever notice that when you finally get that thing? And you go, well, okay, wasn't as great as I thought it was going to be. But there's the anticipation of when you're going to get it. Is kind of, what you're going to get, what you're going to do, and it's kind of fun. Teach kids that. Delaying gratification is a really good skill to have in all areas. I always do, I think, well, I've got 3 things I got to do today. What's the thing I want to do the least? Okay, I'm going to do that first. And then I'm going to do the thing that I really can't wait to do last. That's kind of a good way to look at life, is the way I look at it. Teaching kids about money and saving and putting it aside, so often what happens is kids don't get much of an education about this in the household because a lot of times the parents aren't terribly well versed. But I think a big part about this is this, and this is something I learned growing up. My mother would listen to a radio show on finance every single Saturday morning. And guess who was sitting there with her while she was listening to it? Me. I was sitting there and learning about investing, learning about mutual funds, learning about the investing process, learning about budgeting, learning about types of investment plans, 401ks, and because 401k was brand new back then. And, so that was where I cut my teeth learning about these types of things. But we also talked about this stuff. I watched my dad sit at the kitchen table going through the budget, going through the finances, looking at, you look at what your Social Security benefits are going to be in the future, and then planning his pension because he had a pension, and planning his investments. So when they were able to retire, and he was able to retire early, he semi-retired at age 55. And then he kind of did little stuff, working, did some of the stuff he loved doing. He loved kids. So, he drove a school bus for a while. Did he really, really have to do that? No, not really. He just liked doing that. And then working at the post office because he loved going and delivering mail and just talking to people and just really enjoyed that. So what he did is he transitioned and phased out of work as so often what I recommend to people is just phase out a little by little, just cutting cold turkey can really be a shock to the system for people so often because it's just like I've worked all my life and then all of a sudden, bam, it's over, it's done. So with kids, seeing that example in front of them, so often kids don't listen to what you say, they're going to watch what you do. And so thereby being that example for them and talking about this stuff. We often have workshops on the American Dream Experience, and we talk about, a lot of people have this no talk rule. You can't talk about, it's not polite to talk about money. And because of that, kids don't have any kind of a clue about finances. They don't know anything about what to do, how you think about it. And it's an opportunity to talk about your values and what's really important to you. So they talk about budgeting here too and setting up a budget. And typically, I'm not a great budgeter. Quite frankly, here's my budget. Save a percentage of income and then spend the rest. That's kind of how I operate. I typically have a certain amount I save and then I spend the rest. And, the reality of it is I never worked for me. It never worked for me going and saying that I was going to save or that I was going to spend first, and then if there was anything left over, I'd save it. It just never worked for me. So I always save first, and somehow or other, everything worked out. Now, some people, some of the people that work with me, the guys that work with, they're phenomenal budgeters. They can tell you exactly what they spend on everything. They can tell you what they spend on their grocery bills. They can tell you what they spend on electric and gas and whatever. And their phone, their cell phones and all that stuff. I just don't have a clue. I typically save first, and then everything kind of works out. And if I don't have the money left over to spend, I don't spend it. That's just the way I've always been. And it's worked out quite well for me. But having some kind of budgeting conversation with kids, what do you enjoy spending money on? Discuss different ways that you can earn money. With kids especially, there are lots of different things that they could be doing. How can they earn money? I like having conversations on what are the things that you could do that would earn more money than other things. Because again, it's typically those things that we don't like to do or they're hard to do, tasks that are hard to do or take some preparation that earn more money. And kids get that. They see they see how people earn incomes. They see, what types of careers tend to earn more money than others, and getting them to understand a little bit about making sure that you choose things that not everybody likes to do. Because so often what people do is they go into careers that they just love and it's just a passion, and then they get out of school and they spend all of this money on college education only to find out that there's no job in that particular area. And that there's nothing that they can do to make anything. So, you don't want that type of situation where they go to college and all of a sudden, bam, they're just out there on their own. So that's one thing. Another thing is just in saving in general. Typically, what I get kids to think about is that day that they're going to have their own place, and making sure that they save up to typically 20% of the down payment on the house, so they avoid the PMI, the insurance on the mortgage. If you have less than 20% down payment, you can end up with lots of insurance costs for making sure that the bank is protected against you defaulting on the loan. That's one of the things I think about. Not necessarily thinking about purchasing a house right away is another thing that I'll often teach kids. Hey, look, if you rent for a while, there's no sin against not owning are not owning a house and just renting, because a lot of times kids don't end up in careers where they're going to be living in that place for a long period of time. Or, as I've found, they get into a relationship with somebody and the person they get into a relationship with is like, I don't want to live here. And then they have to sell the house, and you've got the cost of the commissions on the buy side of the house and on the sell side. And then you have the difference in homeowners insurance versus renters insurance. And you have the taxes, property taxes you paid. And then you have all of these expenses of owning a home. And then you end up having to sell it and get what you really want. So sometimes just renting is okay. And quite often you may end up in a job in a totally different part of the state or the city or the country even. And you don't want to be stuck there. So putting money aside for those purchases, paying cash for depreciating items like cars, and having these conversations, important thing to do.